So much. Thank you, Sarah, especially for inviting me and organizing this. Thank you to this working group. It's such a good idea. It's exactly what we need to be doing right now. This is what we can. This is the kind of thing we can do, and it's what we have to do. And I'm really honored to be part of this. So thank you very much. So I. This is just some research I've been putting together as I've gone through history for my historical podcast. And every time I see something like this, I make a note of it. And it turns out there's an incredible amount about food in the history of imperialism. And what I wanted to call my talk today was like something along the lines of the bitter fruit of colonialism. And it's a double meaning, but it's actually not appropriate because there's no fruit of imperialism at all. Imperialism and imperialists hate fruit, as you'll see um, in my talk. So I wanted to start with a article from April 7th by Bilal Noor al-Din. On the cradle, it's called Israel's War on Lebanon's Trees. And the article talks about the Israeli scorched earth policy towards Lebanon. And everything they're doing in Lebanon is 10 times worse in Palestine. But Lebanon, they've damaged 6,000 hectares of agricultural land, 2,000 completely, destroyed 60,000 olive trees, some of which were 300 years old, as well as citrus, banana, and almond trees, fruitful and non-fruitful trees, and vast areas were completely destroyed. That's in Lebanon. There's a quote from an expert from Lebanon's Southern Green Association. There's a clear, deliberate burning of the forest cover, destruction of olive vines and fruit trees, and contamination of the soil, which explains the intensive use of white phosphorus. So it's this is not unique, as I'm gonna get into. Sarah, you saved me a lot of time by describing the famine in Palestine, in Gaza. This is the destruction of fields, the poisoning of fields, the killing of fishermen, the destruction of olive trees, the destruction of orange trees. Again, fruit trees are especially hated. When I got into Gaza through the Erez checkpoint in 2002, the first thing I saw was a bulldozer in the distance bulldozing orange trees. And when I stopped to take a picture, an Israeli soldier kind of called down from the wall that I was not to take pictures. So sort of like the supervised destruction of fruit trees specifically is a big part of what Israel is doing. But we can keep going in the Arab world and talk about all of the different destruction of sovereign food systems throughout that part of the world. There's hunger in Syria now. Syria was never, generally not a place of hunger since independence, but it is a place of hunger now because of the sanctions. In Iraq, people who were involved in the anti-war movement for Iraq, the major anti-war issue before the 2003 war was the sanctions on Iraq. And you may remember the famous quote from Madeleine Albright about on 60 Minutes when they asked her what she thought of the price of being too high, maybe, with 500,000 children dead up to that point. It was in the 90s from sanctions, preventable deaths due to hunger and preventable disease. And she said, yeah, it's a high price, but we think it's worth it. Egypt is dependent on US grain for various reasons that I'll get into. And even Iran, in the days of high imperialism, there was a huge famine in Persia just before World War I. This was, Persia was sort of forced into the imperial system through a series of wars in the 19th century. People don't really think of Persia as one of these places that had a big famine, but people in Iran, they do. They have that memory. So all of this, uh, all of this destruction of the sovereign food system in all of the countries of the so-called Middle East is completely supported by the US and Canada, who used famine to get to where they are. The power system in our continent is also very much based on this kind of destruction. So if you look at the book Clearing the Plains and other books around that, Canada is a story of settler colonialism, as Sarah said, but also it's a story of extinction of keystone species in an ecosystem is how Canada attacks indigenous people, or historically. So they brought various plagues through the fur trade, the Hudson Bay Company, one of these British imperial companies. You'll hear a little bit more about one of these famous companies in a minute. Then they brought about the extinction of the beaver through the fur trade, the destruction of that whole economy, which they had sponsored. Then they moved into the West and brought about the extinction of the buffalo. And the famine that ensued there, as Sarah mentioned, was what they used in the 1880s to finally force the indigenous people of the West onto the tiny reserves that are now being encroached on further by the Canadian state. At that time in the 19th century, Canada was a part of the British Empire, no more and no less. And the British Empire, of course, got to where it is through famine. The Irish famine, which was actually a genocide in the 1840s, that was called, it's diminished to be called a potato famine, but Britain was exporting Irish food from Ireland during that famine. That was a genocide. It was used for many different it fulfilled many different objectives for the British Empire, and they used it also to export a lot of the people of Ireland, including to Canada and the US. Now, the British East India Company was also a company of famines. It was, you can look at Mike Davis's work, the late Victorian Holocausts, but there's also Jason Hickel, and they make estimates every now and then that keep getting bigger. So I had read a couple years ago that the British were responsible for 30 million deaths due to famine, but there's a more recent paper estimating 100 million just over a 40-year period of excess deaths between 1880 and 1920. This is Jason Hickel again. Famines started as soon as Britain took over, the British East India Company took over revenue collection in Bengal after 1757, and it didn't ever stop until independence in India. Then there's hunger. There's a period of hunger. There's a different kind of system, but this kind of British Empire style famine was a model that the British Empire imposed on the world as they were creating the world market in food grain. So they would get grain from Canada, grain from India. There's a quote from Orwell where he says, if an Englishman's arm is thicker than the average Indian person's leg, that's because that's one of the things that we get to enjoy from our empire. And he wasn't exactly against the empire, by the way, but he just said, we might as well be honest about it and the consequences of it. But the British Empire and the global market in food, the point of that whole system was to exercise power, control over the empire using food as a weapon, and also to profit from it by moving the grain around. And these were never separate concepts, profit and power and empire. They're always pursued together. You can imagine an economist could make a conceptual model that there's a way to pursue profit without imposing power and starvation on other people. But in actual history, that's not how things work. There were famines in China in that high period of imperialism that Mike Davis writes about in late Victorian Holocaust, and some big ones in South America too, Brazil and others, as they were all integrated into this British imperial global grain economy that the British were managing. And this means if you're going to turn food into a commodity and food into a weapon, that means the greatest enemy is this horrific thing that can just provide food, like this terrible, terrible thing that just stands there and provides food for people, which is a tree, a fruit tree. Imperialists find this, the way imperialists write about this and the way imperialists destroy these trees is incredible. You come across these quotes, the way when they invaded Afghanistan in the I think it was 1839, sometime around then, they destroyed the mulberry trees by they said, we found a great way to destroy them just by cutting the bark around a ring around the tree. It's great because it destroys the tree, destroys the fruit. The Afghans get really depressed, and we don't even have to cut the tree down. The cedar trees of Lebanon, the olive trees of Lebanon in Palestine, the orange trees of Palestine. There's as I was researching this, people on Twitter, I put it out on Twitter, and then people on Twitter told me about others. Date palms in Iraq, the French destroying fruit trees in Algeria, the United States destroying Diné Navajo peach trees in the 1860s, Portuguese colonists destroying fruit trees in the Angola Ovambo floodplain. Um, and then, of course, we have Vietnam. We have Agent Orange, nuclear tests on the Bikini Islands. Universal Studios during the writer's strike trimmed all the trees along one of these boulevards to deny shade to picketers during the writing strike. So the war on trees is um, pervasive and never lets up. And the other thing, there's one of the most racist imperialist writers was Thomas Carlyle, and one of the most racist essays he wrote was one of the most racist essays ever written, which is called The Discourse on the N-Word Question. So if you ever want to read the most racist essay, this could be it. And one of the things that he writes really passionately about is if Black people have gardens, they can just grow pumpkins and grow the food that they need, and then they won't work hard. And working them hard is the point of imperialism. And so the idea that these people might just be able to live off of the abundance of nature is really, really inspires incredible hatred and destructive impulse among imperialists. So I talked about the British system. There's also the American system. So the American imperial grain economy, it's a little bit different. Um, Generally, it's a little bit more multilateral looking. It's got a few more components because it was designed after the waves of decolonization in Africa and Asia. So it starts with the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the agricultural corporations running amok all over the global South countries that allow them, which is most of them. The agricultural corporations buy land. The World Bank encourages countries to borrow to invest in these cash crops that have to earn a certain amount of foreign exchange to pay back the loans at a given level of interest. The minute you choose these crops, which you've invested in at the encouragement of the World Bank and the agricultural advisors that come along with it, you've lost food sovereignty, right? Subsistence agriculture is the land for that is taken for growing cash crops. And then there's another problem with the agricultural economy, which you scholars of food studies know, which is when you have a good harvest, prices actually go down, which because there's an abundance of the commodity if you have it designed around a commodity market. So you can't ever pay back those loans. The country becomes indebted, and so does the individual farmer. Lots of places farmers commit suicide. The countries restructure their economy and hand over more and more of their assets to these same US and allied corporations. Then when people are hungry, there's a new system, which is food aid provided by the US, which is itself a complex and really, really malign and evil system, in which food aid is given when there are good crops and denied when crops are bad, all to exert a really detailed control over people and people's lives and economies. So, but then this also gives a host of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, control over the social sector that's just been destroyed through the restructuring. And if a government comes that doesn't like this and isn't easily overthrown, that's when sanctions come in. And sanctions, again, easy to impose, and hunger quickly follows. So food is a weapon at so many different stages of this, and all of it being used to ensure the control of the system by the imperialists. And what is all of this doing? It's all imposing a monocultural and ecologically destructive agricultural model to replace the many ingenious food systems of indigenous cultures. And we can go like continent by continent. There's some amazing work on Australia, one book called The Greatest Plantation on Earth, another one called Dark Emu, which talks about their extensive management of the landscape, the Aboriginal management of the landscape using fire, a lot of fire, but like the concept of like the entire continent being a single food system under indigenous management. Hawaii has a totally different style in a wet ecosystem using ponds and fish ponds and taro and a whole bunch of different foods. Their agricultural systems of the West Coast, incredible indigenous systems destroyed fairly recently in US history. The Eastern US, there's a book by William Cronon, some of you probably know, and he talks about, there's a chapter called Seasons of Want and Plenty. That's another agricultural system which had an incredible seasonal abundance that settlers didn't understand and deliberately destroyed by releasing pigs and dogs. They had a whole ecological warfare way of encroaching on indigenous lands and destroying their food systems. You probably heard about from Charles Mann, 1491, Mexico, the system of lakes at Tenochtitlan described by the Spanish conquistadors, extensive markets. The city was cleaner and more populous than European cities. There are canals everywhere. It's like a city in a lake, kind of unimaginable what they destroyed there. And then the Amazon from the same book, 1491 by Charles Mann, it was inhabited for longer than it was a rainforest. So there's evidence of human habitation that basically suggests that the Amazon rainforest, the wildest place you can imagine, is actually a co-creation with an indigenous civilizations that inhabited it. So you think of a wild landscape as a North American environmentalist, and it turns out that it's actually an indigenous cultural co-created landscape. And so bringing it back to Palestine, this is what we see in Palestine is the war over the land, the war over the food system, and the destruction of a food system as a primary weapon of the colonizer or the imperialist to try to impose their domination. And the solution is clear enough. In all of these cases, there's a synthesis of modern knowledge and technology that is constantly being appropriated by indigenous nations and First Nations. And when they get their land back, they are quickly able to do amazing things when sovereignty is there. So it's very it's as stark and clear a war on indigenous people and indigenous food systems as we could possibly have witnessed in any time in the past 500 years, and it's we're witnessing it now. So I think I'll stop there and hand it over to the next